Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we are literally tearing apart the anatomy of the moon landing hoax. We're going to dig into the specific claims, the actual science, and the absolute logistical nightmare it would take to pull off something like this. Let's get right into it.
Was the greatest achievement in human history staged on a Hollywood movie set? Now, I know that question sounds kind of crazy to a lot of you, but it actually deserves a real honest look. Think about it. July 21st, 1969, Apollo 11 makes history. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin step out of the Eagle lunar module, and boom, first humans walking on the moon. An absolute triumph, right? But today, we're exploring this really wild mystery. Why are there such loud voices claiming that this whole thing, the rockets, the spacewalks, the global broadcasts, was just entirely faked?
What's super fascinating to me is the sheer tension in the numbers here. When Apollo 11 actually touched down, a staggering 600 million people watched it unfold live. I mean, 600 million. It was this massive, globally shared experience. But despite all those eyes watching, surveys show that today, between 5 to 10% of Americans are totally convinced the whole thing was staged. We're talking millions of people who genuinely think we never even left Earth. So, to understand why they think that, we've got to start with the motive.
To really investigate this fairly, let's steelman the conspiracy theory and look at the historical context. The theorists argue, and they have a point here, that the US government had a massive, desperate motive to fake it. We're talking about the space race. Late 1950s, the US and the Soviets are locked in this incredibly fierce rivalry. Then, in 1961, the Soviets pull ahead. Yuri Gagarin successfully orbits the Earth. So terrified of losing, President Kennedy makes this incredibly bold pledge in 1962. We're going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The hoax theorists argue that realizing they couldn't actually meet JFK's insane 7-year deadline, the US panicked. They hired filmmakers to fake the footage just so they could claim that ultimate ideological victory over the Soviets.
All right, so with that huge motive in mind, let's dive into the physical clues people point to. Claim number 1 is all about the background. If you look at the iconic photos taken on the lunar surface, the sky is just this jet black void. Theorists look at that and say, hold on, if they're actually in space, where are all the stars? Did the studio crew literally just forget to paint them on the backdrop?
It's a fair question, but it perfectly highlights the difference between how we expect things to work here on Earth versus actual lunar physics. Down here, we step outside at night, our eyes adjust to the dark, and we see stars. But the lunar reality? Totally different ballgame. The astronauts were standing on this brilliantly sunlit, highly reflective white lunar surface, and they were wearing blindingly white spacesuits. To capture those incredibly bright subjects without just blowing out the image completely, the cameras needed super fast exposure times. That split-second shutter speed just doesn't let in enough light to capture the incredibly faint starlight in the background. Honestly, if they left the shutter open long enough to catch the stars, the astronauts wouldn't look like people at all. They'd just be these huge, glowing, overexposed blobs of white light.
Okay, moving on to the second major anomaly, and this one is probably the most famous, Buzz Aldrin's American flag. In the video footage, the flag clearly looks like it's fluttering. Hoax believers quite logically ask, how on Earth, or rather, how on the moon, can a flag wave in the breeze when there's absolutely no atmosphere and therefore zero wind? The key here is totally counterintuitive physics. On Earth, if you wave a flag and let go, air resistance immediately hits the fabric and slows it down to a dead stop. But remember the lunar reality. It's a vacuum, zero air, absolutely zero air resistance. When the astronauts were physically twisting and shoving that metal flagpole deep into the tough lunar dirt, they were actually transferring a huge amount of kinetic energy right into the pole in the fabric. And because there's no air to act as a brake and slow that momentum down, that initial physical force just kept the flag rippling and fluttering for a really long time. So it wasn't the wind moving it. It was literally the total absence of wind that kept it moving.
All right, let's move to the third claim, the lighting. In several of the famous photographs, the shadows cast by the astronauts in the lunar module seem to point in different, almost intersecting directions. Plus, you can sometimes clearly see the astronauts brightly lit, even when they're standing completely in the dark shadow of the lunar module. For conspiracy theorists, this right here is the smoking gun. They argue it absolutely proves there were multiple hidden studio lights set up around a soundstage.
It sounds convincing, right? But let's break down how light actually behaves up there. First off, the shadows. Yes, shadows on a perfectly flat surface fall completely parallel from a single light source like the sun, but the moon is basically the opposite of flat. It's covered in craters, weird dips, and random hills. This wildly uneven terrain naturally warps and slants the shadows, making them look like they're going in different directions. Actually, the Mythbusters team proved this exact phenomenon right here on Earth. Second, what about those brightly lit astronauts in the dark shadows? Well, it turns out the moon's surface acts like one giant, super dusty bounce board. The lunar soil is highly reflective, so it literally catches the sun's light and bounces it right back up into the dark spots, naturally illuminating anything hiding in the shadows. No studio lights required.
Now we hit the final microphysics claim, and this one is literally a matter of life and death. Surrounding the Earth are the Van Allen belts. These are huge zones of highly concentrated, super dangerous radiation trapped from the sun. Hoax theorists argue that flying straight through this lethal radiation field without massive ultra-thick lead shielding would have instantly killed the Apollo astronauts. They say the trip was physically impossible right from the start.
Well, they're not wrong about the danger. Space radiation is absolutely lethal. For example, if we ever head to Mars, which takes months, radiation shielding is going to be a massive, massive hurdle. But here's the thing. The Apollo missions weren't months long. The absolute crucial variable here is speed. The Apollo spacecraft was moving incredibly fast. It literally punched right through the most intense parts of the Van Allen belts in just over an hour. So while the thin hull of their ship definitely couldn't protect them long term, it easily blocked the bulk of the radiation during that super brief transit window. They got in and they got out, safely.
Okay, so that's the physics side of things. But let's zoom out for a second and look at human nature. Because, faking the science in a studio is one thing. Silencing the people involved is a whole different beast. We need to look at the massive macro logistics it would actually take to maintain a cover-up of this insane magnitude.
Just really think about the sheer scale of this for a moment. The Apollo space program employed over 400,000 scientists, engineers, technicians, and administrators. For the hoax theory to hold any water at all, the US government would have had to keep every single one of those 400,000 people completely, absolutely silent since 1969. Think about that. Not one single deathbed confession, not one accidental leaked memo. And keep in mind, the administration running the show back then, Richard Nixon, literally the exact same administration that completely failed to cover up a hotel break-in during the Watergate scandal. Yet, we're supposed to believe they flawlessly silenced 500,000 space workers. It just doesn't add up.
And honestly, that leads us right into the most glaring logical absurdity of the entire conspiracy: the Soviet Union. As we talked about earlier, they were America's ultimate rival. They had their own highly sophisticated tracking equipment, and they were intensely monitoring every single blip of telemetry from those Apollo missions. If anyone on the planet had the motive, the technology, and the burning desire to expose the US and totally embarrass them on the global stage, it was the Soviets. So, why didn't they?
Well, the answer is pretty straightforward: global verification. They didn't expose the hoax because there simply wasn't a hoax to expose. The Soviet Union rigorously tracked the U.S. spacecraft and independently confirmed the physical landings themselves. Plus, independent radio operators all over the world were picking up the Apollo signals, pinging directly from the moon. And here's the kicker. The astronauts brought back actual moon rocks. Scientists globally analyzed these samples and confirmed, yep, these are 100% unearthly. How do we know for sure? Because they perfectly match the completely independent lunar samples that unmanned Soviet rovers brought back later. The global scientific consensus was, and still is, completely unanimous.
Yet, I get it. Even with a mountain of historical and scientific data, some folks still demand modern, physical evidence. They want to see it with their own eyes today. Well, the really cool thing is, modern technology has given us exactly that. We have absolute, undeniable visual confirmation that the landings happened exactly the way they said they did.
Let's look at exactly how we know this for sure right now. In 2009, NASA sent up the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or the LRO. Its job was to systematically map out the original Apollo landing sites. And guess what? It photographed every single lunar module sitting exactly where the 1960s record said they were. Then, in 2011, they dipped the orbiter's altitude even lower. The cameras were so incredibly sharp, they actually captured the astronauts' original tracks and footprints, perfectly preserved in the lunar dust. By 2012, they even confirmed that the Apollo flags planted decades ago are still there, still casting shadows. Well, except for one, which the video actually shows getting blown over by the exhaust when they launched to come home. And by the way, it's not just NASA saying this. Probes from other countries, like India, have completely backed this up with their own photos.
But you know what? You don't even need a multi-million-dollar satellite to prove it. You can literally prove it right from Earth. During Apollo 11, 14, and 15, the astronauts actually placed retroreflectors directly onto the moon's surface. Think of them as basically really specialized high-tech mirrors. To this day, observatories all over the world routinely fire powerful lasers exactly at those coordinates. The laser beams through space, hits the little prism left by a human being, and bounces a signal straight back to Earth. If you aim that laser literally anywhere else on the moon, you get absolutely nothing. The physical hardware is sitting there right now, interacting with our lasers today. That is pretty mind-blowing.
Okay, so that usually brings up one final lingering question that almost always pops up when we talk about Apollo. And honestly, it's a super fair question. If we really went, and it was this unbelievable, history-altering triumph, why on earth did we stop? Why haven't we been back a single time since 1972?
The answer really just boils down to changing priorities and, well, cash. Once the massive ideological victory of the space race was completely secured, the Soviet Union kind of just lost interest in competing for second place. And without that intense pressure of a superpower rivalry breathing down their necks, the US government looked at the absolutely astronomical cost of returning to the moon and just couldn't justify it anymore. So logically, they shifted their focus and all that funding toward more immediate practical stuff, launching near-Earth satellites, building the Space Shuttle program, and eventually the International Space Station. We didn't give up on space at all, we just decided to build our infrastructure a little closer to home.
And that pretty much wraps up our investigation. Look, having a skeptical mind is super healthy, and questioning authority is an absolutely vital part of any society. But stubbornly denying empirical proof definitely comes at a cost. Overcoming the vacuum of space, surviving that intense radiation, and physically stepping onto another world was just an incredibly inspiring human achievement. It took the blood, sweat, and tears of hundreds of thousands of dedicated people. To brush all of that off as a Hollywood hoax, especially when faced with overwhelming physical evidence, really does require, as our source material brilliantly puts it, one small narrow mind and one giant leap of the imagination. But as we gear up right now for the new Artemis missions to finally put humans back on the moon later this decade, you really have to wonder, what wild new conspiracy theories are we going to be debunking 50 years from now? Thanks for hanging out and exploring this with me today.